The unfinished garden. The roses at Hartwell House had never looked so magnificent, and everyone in Lesser Dunning said so. It was the kind of late June afternoon that the English countryside produces perhaps twice a decade. Warm without cruelty, fragrant without heaviness, the sky a particular shade of blue that made even the most pragmatic soul pause and consider the possibility of grace. The garden fete in aid of the Church Restoration Fund had drawn nearly every resident of Lesser Dunning, and a fair number of visitors from the surrounding villages, all of them drifting through the immaculate grounds of Hartwell House in their summer finery, admiring the herbaceous borders, consuming remarkable quantities of Mrs. Babington's Victoria sponge, and exchanging the sort of conversation that sounds pleasant and means very little. And Miss Jane Marple had arrived at 2:30, escorted by her neighbour, Mrs. Wetherall, who had insisted on the arrangement with the kind of cheerful tyranny that passes for generosity in small communities. "You must come, Miss Marple. The fresh air will do you a world of good. And besides, Violet Hartwell specifically asked after you. She said you were the only person in the village with whom she could have a sensible conversation about dahlias." Miss Marple had accepted with quiet pleasure. She was, after all, genuinely fond of dahlias. Now she stood near the far wall of the walled garden, a cup of rather weak tea in her hand, wearing her good grey cardigan despite the warmth. Her niece Raymond's wife was always urging her to adopt something more colourful, but Miss Marple had long since decided that grey was both comfortable and useful, as it encouraged people to look straight through you. And she was watching. There was rather a great deal worth watching. Violet Hartwell, the widowed mistress of Hartwell House, moved through her guests with the careful animation of a woman performing a role she had rehearsed too many times. She was 53, handsome in a drawn sort of way, and dressed in pale green that suited her rather less than she imagined. She laughed frequently and touched people's arms when she spoke to them, and her eyes, Miss Marple noticed, moved every few minutes to the same spot near the ornamental pond, where a young man sat alone on a stone bench, studying his shoes. The young man was Oliver Hartwell, Violet's son, but he was 26 and had returned from London 3 weeks ago, under circumstances that Lesser Dunning had been debating with considerable energy ever since. Some said he had lost his position at the architectural firm. Others, with more imagination and less charity, suggested darker reasons for the return. He had his mother's colouring, fair, a little washed out, and his late father's jaw, which gave him an expression of stubbornness that may or may not have been deserved. Beside Miss Marple, Mrs. Wetherall leaned in with the practised subtlety of someone who has never once been subtle. "There's Geoffrey Parish," she murmured, nodding toward a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s who was accepting a glass of Pimm's from a tray with an air of comfortable proprietorship. "Violet's been seeing him, you know. Or so people say." "People say a great many things," Miss Marple observed pleasantly. "Well, in this case they're quite right. He was here for dinner twice last month, and Agnes, who does the flowers, saw his motor car parked in the lane on a Thursday evening when Violet claimed to be visiting her sister in Cirencester." Mrs. Wetherall paused to enjoy the weight of this information. "And Oliver doesn't like him. Not one bit. You can see it from here." Miss Marple could indeed see it from here. Oliver had looked up from his shoes the moment Parish arrived, and something had moved across the young man's face. Not merely dislike, she thought, but something sharper and more complicated. Dislike was simple. This was the expression of someone confronting a specific injustice they have had time to rehearse, but not to resolve. "Who else is here?" Miss Marple asked, in the tone of a woman making idle conversation. "Oh, the usual, Reverend Thwaite, though his wife's unwell again, poor soul. The Drummond sisters, there, by the roses, do you see? Edith and Claire. Claire was engaged to Edward Hartwell before he died, you know. Donkeys years ago, but she never quite got over it. Comes to every event Violet holds, and neither of them ever mentions it. Remarkable, really." Mrs. Wetherall considered this for a moment. "Or perhaps not so remarkable. English, aren't we?" Miss Marple smiled and sipped her tea, and noted Claire Drummond, a small, precise woman of perhaps 60, with silver hair and the posture of someone who has been holding themselves very straight for a very long time. She was examining a rose with apparent absorption, but her gaze, too, Miss Marple observed, drifted occasionally, not toward the pond, toward Violet. It was at 20 minutes past 4 that the afternoon changed. The change was not dramatic at first. It began as a kind of ripple, a pause in the general noise, a turning of heads, and then someone said, "Good heavens!" and then someone else said, "Fetch someone," and the ripple became a wave. Geoffrey Parrish had been found in the conservatory at the north end of the house, slumped in a wicker chair among the potted camellias. He was quite dead. The doctor arrived in 11 minutes. The police came after, and Lesser Dunning, which had been a village where nothing of consequence had happened since the disputed result of the 1987 flower show, became, with very little warning, the sort of village where a man had been murdered at a garden party on a beautiful June afternoon. Miss Marple set down her cup of weak tea on the nearest table and looked for just a moment at the ornamental pond. Oliver Hartwell was still sitting on his bench. He had not moved. The police, in the form of Detective Inspector Groves and a young constable whose helmet sat slightly too large upon his head, arrived with the efficiency of men who had trained for precisely this sort of emergency, and had never quite expected to use that training in Lesser Dunning. Inspector Groves was a compact, brisk man of 40, with a neat moustache, and the manner of someone perpetually correcting a first impression. He had the policeman's useful habit of looking at everything in a room except the person he was actually studying, and he moved through the conservatory with purposeful calm, speaking quietly to the doctor and making notes in a small grey book. The guests had been gathered on the terrace, gently but firmly, in the way that leaves no real room for objection, and stood about in the particular English configuration of a group that wants very badly to leave and is too well-mannered to say so. The Victoria sponge sat abandoned on its table. Wasps had found it. Miss Marple had positioned herself near the stone balustrade, slightly apart from the main cluster of guests in the manner of someone who is simply resting her feet. She was, in fact, listening with the whole of her attention. The Drummond sisters stood together, Edith's hand on Claire's arm. Edith was the elder by 3 years and the more voluble by a considerable margin. "Oh, heart," she was saying with great conviction, "it will be his heart. A man that size, that colour, Geoffrey Parrish, has looked like a coronary waiting to happen for at least 5 years. I said so to you, Claire, didn't I? Last Easter. I said it." "You said it," Claire confirmed. Her voice was even and uninflected. "The police are here rather quickly for a heart attack," observed a dry voice beside them. This was Dr. Arthur Fenwick, the village's retired physician, who had come to the fete as a guest, but had been one of the first summoned to the conservatory. He was 71, lean as a winter branch. and had the impatient precision of a man who has spent 5 decades watching people arrive at conclusions they could have reached much sooner. "It isn't his heart," Dr. Fenwick added, without any particular relish. I'll leave the specifics to the official channels, but it isn't his heart." Edith Drummond drew a sharp breath. Claire said nothing, but her posture, already very straight, became marginally straighter. Across the terrace, Violet Hartwell sat in a garden chair that a young constable had fetched for her, her pale green dress very still against the grey stone. She had her hands folded in her lap in a way that suggested considerable effort, and she was answering Inspector Groves's questions in a low, controlled voice. Her son stood 2 paces behind her left shoulder, not beside her, Miss Marple noticed, which would have been the natural position of a son offering support, but behind and slightly separate, as though he had calculated a precise distance that was near enough to be present and far enough to be uninvolved. Mrs. Wetherall had migrated from Miss Marple's side to the centre of the terrace, where she was performing the considerable social feat of listening to 4 conversations simultaneously and contributing to all of them. "He'd only been in the village 4 years, she was saying to the Reverend Thwaite, whose long face had taken on the cautiously mournful expression of a man deciding which prayers would be appropriate. People liked him well enough, but nobody really knew him, did they? He never talked about where he was before Cheltenham, and that business with the planning application last autumn. Now, said Reverend Thwaite, which was his customary response to sentences that interested him. The Marchmont land, Mrs. Wetherall continued. Parish wanted to develop it. Holiday lets, some sort of leisure complex. And there were those who said he'd been rather free with certain assurances he had no authority to make. To get the local support, you understand. Several people felt quite deceived when the application came through, and it wasn't at all what they'd been led to believe. Several people, Miss Marple said very gently, from her position by the balustrade. Mrs. Wetherall turned, apparently surprised to find her still there. Oh, several. The Drummonds, of course. Their land borders the Marchmont property. And young Oliver Hartwell did some preliminary architectural work for Parish, I believe, before the whole thing fell through. Rather badly out of pocket, from what I understand. Miss Marple said, "How unfortunate," in the sympathetic tone of someone filing information for future reference. It was then that Oliver Hartwell left his position behind his mother's chair and walked, with studied casualness, toward the far end of the terrace. He stopped near Miss Marple, or rather, he stopped near the balustrade and happened to be near Miss Marple, which was a distinction that would have been legible to very few people, and was entirely legible to her. He looked out over the garden. The shadows had begun to lengthen across the lawn. "They'll think it was me," he said, almost conversationally. Miss Marple looked at her teacup. "Will they?" "Parish and I had a rather loud disagreement. Last week, at the White Hart. Half the village heard it." He paused. "I'm not helping my case by telling you this. I'm aware of that. But someone will tell the police within the next 20 minutes. And I'd rather it sound like I have nothing to hide." "That is," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, "a very rational approach." Oliver glanced at her sideways. Whatever he'd expected from the small, grey cardiganed woman by the balustrade, it was apparently not this. He seemed faintly disconcerted. "Did you know Mr. Parish well?" Miss Marple asked. "Well enough." A pause that contained a great deal. "He owed me money. Or rather, he had made certain promises, and then found it convenient to forget them. Men like Parish are very good at forgetting things." "Yes," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "they often are. A constable appeared at the terrace doors and announced that the inspector would like to speak to each guest individually. The group began to shift and murmur. Oliver Hartwell straightened, and the brief frankness that had opened in him closed again, quietly, like a window against rain. Miss Marple watched him walk away and thought of several things at once. Of the expression on Claire Drummond's face when she looked at Violet. Of the precise distance Oliver had kept from his mother's chair, and of a particular word Geoffrey Parrish had used in argument at the White Hart. A word that Mrs. Wetherall would mention quite incidentally before the evening was out. A word that would mean nothing to anyone, and would mean a very great deal to Miss Marple. She had not yet heard the word, but she was quite certain it was coming. The interviews were conducted in Violet Hartwell's morning room, a pleasant space that smelled of lavender and old paper, and had clearly been arranged by someone with strong feelings about symmetry, and the chairs matched, the curtains matched. Even the two small watercolours above the fireplace were paired with a precision that suggested not decoration but effort. The effort of a woman who had decided, at some point, that order was its own kind of safety. Miss Marple waited her turn on the terrace with the patient composure that people frequently mistook for vagueness. She had, over the course of a long life, found this mistake extraordinarily useful. The Drummond sisters had gone in together, which Inspector Groves had permitted with the slightly harassed air of a man who has learned that certain battles are not worth the ground they occupy. They emerged after 12 minutes, Edith talking, Claire silent, and resumed their position near the rose beds, as though resuming a posture interrupted mid-thought. Mrs. Wetherall went in and was in for 19 minutes, which surprised no one. Reverend Thwaite went in for 8, came out looking prayerful in a general sort of way, and immediately sought out Dr. Fenwick for a conversation conducted in lowered voices with frequent glances towards the conservatory. Oliver Hartwell was in for 31 minutes. He came out with the composed expression of a man who had said exactly what he intended to say, and is now engaged in the private business of hoping it was enough. Miss Marple was called in at 5:30. Inspector Groves looked up from his grey notebook with the expression of a man who has been interviewing people for 3 hours, and has found the exercise both exhausting and insufficient. He was courteous, he was always courteous, but there was about him the faint impatience of someone who has already identified his answer, and is now merely completing the paperwork of confirmation. Miss Marple, you're a resident of St. Mary Mead, is that correct? Visiting for the fête? That's right, Inspector. Mrs. Wetherall was kind enough to bring me. I've known Violet Hartwell, Mrs. Hartwell, for several years through the Church Restoration Committee. And Mr. Parrish, were you acquainted with him? I had not met him before today. I did see him arrive, at about 3:30, I think. He seemed in perfectly good spirits. Quite. Groves made a note. Did you observe anything during the afternoon that seemed unusual to you? Anything that struck you as out of place? Miss Marple considered this with an air of effortful concentration, as though the question required her to excavate memories from considerable depth. Well, she said, I'm not sure it is the sort of thing you would call unusual, exactly. But I did notice that Mr. Parrish went into the house at approximately 4 o'clock, through the side door, the one near the kitchen garden. And he was followed, perhaps 3 or 4 minutes later, by someone else. Groves's pen stopped. By whom? I'm afraid I couldn't say with certainty. I only caught a glimpse, and my eyes are not what they were. Someone in pale clothing, I thought, but I may very well be mistaken." She offered a self-deprecating smile. "At my age, one does sometimes see patterns where there are none. A habit of a long life, I am afraid." Groves studied her for a moment, then wrote something down. "Thank you, Miss Marple. We may want to speak with you again." "Of course, Inspector. Any time at all." She emerged from the morning room into the corridor and stood for a moment, perfectly still, her head slightly tilted, listening. From the drawing room to her left came the low sound of Violet Hartwell's voice, and another voice responding, a woman's, gentle and quite steady. Miss Marple moved a few steps along the corridor with the unhurried drift of someone looking for the cloakroom, and through the half-open drawing-room door she saw Violet seated on the sofa, and beside her, not the constable who had been assigned to stay with her, but Claire Drummond. Claire was holding Violet's hand. It was such a small thing, and yet Miss Marple stood very still and looked at it with the attention she might have given to a rather important document. Violet was speaking in a low, unsteady voice. "I don't know what he told people. I don't know what Oliver—" She stopped. "Claire, if they start asking about the summer, about what Geoffrey said to me in May—" "They won't," Claire said. "There's no reason for them to." "But if they do—" "Violet." Claire's voice was exceedingly calm. "One thing at a time." Miss Marple moved quietly away before she could be observed, and found the actual cloakroom, and stood inside it for a moment in the dim, coat-smelling dark, thinking. She thought about the particular way Claire had said one thing at a time, not with the reassurance of a friend, but with the steadiness of a person who has already arranged things in a sequence and is committed to that sequence. She thought about the planning application and the Marchmont land, and about Oliver's money, and about the summer. Which summer, she wondered, and what had happened in it. She thought about a holiday she had taken some years ago in Lyme Regis, where she had watched the sea smooth over the evidence of a storm, with such efficiency that by noon there was nothing left to see. People did the same thing, she had observed. The smoothing was often mistaken for healing. They were not the same process at all. When she came out of the cloakroom, the corridor was empty. She made her way back to the terrace, where the last of the guests were collecting their things in the subdued manner of people leaving a place that has become, in the course of an afternoon, entirely different from the place they arrived at. Mrs. Wetherell was waiting with her cardigan and her handbag, and the expression of someone bursting with material. "Oliver Hartwell," she said, the moment Miss Marple was within earshot. "Do you know what Parrish called him? In the White Hart last week, when they argued, he called him a thief." Miss Marple received this information with a small, thoughtful nod. There it was. The word she had been waiting for, arriving precisely on schedule, as words in small villages always did. The word thief settled over Lesser Dunning like weather. By Sunday morning it had reached the post office, the butcher's, the small newsagent on Candle Street where Mr. Hobbs sold papers and listened with the professional discretion of a man who charges nothing for the service and forgets nothing either. By Sunday afternoon it had acquired elaborations. By Sunday evening it had become, in certain households, established fact. Oliver Hartwell had stolen money from Geoffrey Parrish. Oliver Hartwell had been confronted. Oliver Hartwell had, here the village divided, some favouring passion, others premeditation, all of them certain. Miss Marple heard several versions of this emerging consensus during the course of Sunday, as she had arranged to remain in Lesser Dunning at the Dunning Arms. a small hotel of the kind that smells permanently of yesterday's breakfast and maintains its carpets in a state of determined cheerfulness. Mrs. Wetherell had urged her own spare room, but Miss Marple had declined with warm gratitude, explaining that she did not wish to be any trouble, and meaning that she wished to be within easy walking distance of the village without the complication of a hostess. She had spoken to Inspector Groves again that morning. He had come to the Dunning Arms himself, which she found interesting. It suggested he was either being thorough or was more uncertain than he wished to appear. "We've had the preliminary results from the post-mortem," he said over indifferent coffee in the hotel's small sitting-room. "Parrish died from the effects of a substantial quantity of digoxin, not a natural level. The question is how it was administered." "He was drinking Pimm's," Miss Marple said. Groves looked at her steadily. "He was, as were approximately 30 other people at the fete, which complicates matters considerably." A pause. "His glass hasn't been located." "How inconvenient," said Miss Marple, in a tone that suggested she found it rather the opposite. "Miss Marple?" Groves set down his coffee with the air of a man deciding to be direct. Oliver Hartwell had a documented argument with the deceased. He had financial grievances, significant ones, it appears. The architectural work he did for the Marchmont development was never paid for, and Parrish had actively blocked him from claiming it through the courts by disputing the terms of their arrangement. We're talking about somewhere in the region of £18,000. A considerable sum, quite. And Hartwell has no alibi for the period between 4 and 4:30, during which we believe the poison was administered. He says he was walking in the grounds alone. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "he would say that." Groves studied her. "You sound unconvinced?" "Oh, not at all, Inspector. It's simply that walking alone in the grounds of the house where your mother lives during a garden party is a perfectly natural thing to do, particularly if one is troubled. Young men who are troubled often walk." She paused. "And young men who have committed murder rarely position themselves in plain sight and then tell the detective on the case within hours of the body being found that they had a public argument with the victim. It seems, if you'll forgive me, a rather incomplete sort of guilt." Groves was quiet for a moment. "You noticed that?" "I notice most things," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "It is the great advantage of being old and apparently harmless." She walked to the village shop after Groves left, not because she needed anything, but because the village shop in Lesser Dunning she had established was run by a Mrs. Pooley, who had the comprehensive local knowledge of a woman who has operated a till in the same community for 30 years, and has a memory like a very well-organized filing cabinet. She bought a packet of biscuits she didn't want, and admired the display of local honey. And within 7 minutes Mrs. Pooley had mentioned, entirely naturally, that Geoffrey Parrish had been a regular customer, that he had been pleasant enough in a rather impersonal way, that he had sometimes been accompanied by Violet Hartwell, and that was a matter of local interest, certainly, and that the one time Claire Drummond had come in while he was there, this was back in March, the atmosphere had been extremely peculiar. "Peculiar how?" Miss Marple asked, examining a jar of honey with apparent absorption. "She went white," Mrs. Pooley said with relish, "utterly white the moment she saw him. He said good morning, very smooth, and she said nothing at all, and walked straight back out. Left her basket on the counter and everything. Edith had to come back for it an hour later. Had they met before, do you think? Before Mr. Parrish came to Lesser Dunning?" Mrs. Pooley lowered her voice with the instinct of a woman who has spent decades perfecting the intimate register. "That's exactly what people wondered. Claire Drummond hasn't said a word about it, but she's not the sort who would, is she?" It was not a question. Miss Marple paid for her biscuits and walked back through the village in the mild morning air, past the church where Reverend Thwaite was arranging something in the porch, past the White Hart where the argument had taken place, past the lane that led eventually to Hartwell House. She was thinking about Claire Drummond's face in the shop in March, about the particular quality of a response that is not surprise but recognition, the moment when something you have been waiting for, with dread, arrives at last. She was also thinking about digoxin. It was, she reflected, a very specific choice of poison. Not dramatic, not violent, something that a person might come to know through proximity to illness, or through a professional acquaintance with medicine, or through the careful private study of a particular problem over a considerable period of time. It was, she thought, a patient poison. And patience was not, in her experience, the characteristic of a young man in the grip of sudden rage over £18,000. Patience was something else entirely. On Monday morning, Miss Marple asked to see the conservatory. She made the request of Inspector Groves with the diffident air of a woman asking a small and probably inconvenient favour, and Groves, who had by now developed a cautious respect for her that he would not yet have put into words, arranged it without difficulty. A constable, not the one with the oversized helmet, but a young woman named Peake, who had the quiet alertness of someone who listens before she speaks, drove Miss Marple to Hartwell House at 10 o'clock. The Violet Hartwell received them in the hall. She had slept badly. This was apparent in the fine tissue of strain around her eyes, though she had dressed carefully and her hair was composed. She was the sort of woman, Miss Marple thought, who would dress carefully in the middle of a shipwreck, not from vanity, but because the act of dressing carefully was itself a form of insistence. "I am still here. I am still managing. Please do not look too closely." "I hope this won't take long," Violet said to Constable Peake rather than to Miss Marple, which was natural enough. Peake was the official presence. But Miss Marple noticed it. "Not long at all," she said warmly. "I simply find that I can think more clearly when I've actually seen a place. An old woman's peculiarity, I'm afraid. I do apologize for the inconvenience." Violet looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to categorize, and then led them through the house. The conservatory was a long, light-filled space attached to the north end of Hartwell House. Victorian in construction, recently maintained. Camellias in large terracotta pots. 2 wicker chairs. A low table between them. At the far end, a potting bench with the customary accumulation of small tools, twine, empty seed packets. The door to the kitchen garden stood at the near end, still with its police tape removed to a single strip across the frame. Miss Marple moved through the space with the unhurried attention of someone visiting a house they are considering purchasing. She looked at the chairs. She looked at the table. She looked at the floor. Flagstone, each with a small dark rug between the chairs that had been slightly displaced and not replaced precisely. She looked at the potting bench for rather a long time. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, "do you do much of the gardening yourself?" Violet had remained near the door. "Some, the roses mostly. I have a gardener for the heavy work, Mr. Tring. He comes 3 days a week. He was here Friday morning, not in the afternoon." "And the conservatory? Is this your space? Or it was always more Geoffrey's recently?" a small pause in which something moved through Violet's expression and was controlled. He liked to sit here. He found it peaceful. He knew the house well then. Yes. Just the one word, but it was freighted. Miss Marple had drifted, as if unconsciously, toward the potting bench. On it sat the customary things: trowels, a ball of garden twine, a stack of small terracotta pots, a pair of cotton gardening gloves. And beside the gloves, a small brown glass bottle with a white label. Constable Peake had stepped forward and noted it on Friday. It had been identified, logged, and dismissed. It was a proprietary rooting hormone preparation, entirely unremarkable in a gardening context, purchased from a nursery supplier. Miss Marple had read this in the notes Groves had permitted her to review, with the slightly surprised generosity of a man who has decided, for reasons he hasn't fully examined, to trust someone. She looked at the bottle. She looked at the gardening gloves. She said, "How interesting," very quietly, in a tone that carried no particular weight. "Is something wrong?" Constable Peake asked. "Not at all. I was only thinking that the gloves are on the right side of the bottle." She paused. "The bottle is a screw top, and the gloves have been used recently. There's soil on the right thumb, but the right glove is inside out." Peake looked. Violet looked. "Gloves get turned inside out when someone removes them in a hurry," Miss Marple continued, with the air of someone making a perfectly general observation. "Or when someone puts them on while their hands are already wet. One doesn't like to touch certain things with bare hands, naturally." There was a silence. Violet said, "I don't see what gardening gloves have to do with anything." "Probably nothing at all," Miss Marple agreed cheerfully. "As I said, an old woman's peculiarity. Do you know, I think I would love a cup of tea if it isn't too much trouble. But the drive over quite dried me out." In the kitchen, while Violet moved between kettle and cupboards with the automatic competence of a hostess on difficult ground, Miss Marple sat at the scrubbed oak table and thought about several other things she had noticed and had not mentioned. The first was that the small dark rug between the wicker chairs had been displaced toward the door to the kitchen garden, toward it, not away from it, which meant it had been caught by something moving in that direction. The second was that one of the terracotta pots on the potting bench had a very faint ring of dried residue inside it, of the kind left by liquid recently. The third was a thing she had seen not in the conservatory at all, but in the hall as they entered, a small detail so minor that she was quite certain no one else had registered it, and which she intended to sit with quietly for a little while longer before she decided what it meant. Violet set the tea things on the table and sat down opposite with the careful composure of a woman being observed. She was being observed. "Tell me," Miss Marple said pleasantly, wrapping both hands around her cup, "how long had you known Claire Drummond before you came to Lesser Dunning?" The composure held, but the hands folded on the table tightened almost imperceptibly. "We met here," Violet said, "when we moved." Miss Marple smiled and sipped her tea and said nothing further. Sometimes the most informative answers are the ones given too quickly and too simply by someone who has had time to prepare them. Tuesday brought rain. It came in the particular, unhurried way of English summer rain, not dramatic but thorough, settling over Lesser Dunning with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. The high street emptied. The hanging baskets dripped. Inside the Dunning Arms, the smell of yesterday's breakfast was replaced by the smell of wet coats, which was in some ways an improvement. Miss Marple sat in the small residence lounge with her knittings and Dr. Fenwick, whom she had invited for coffee, with the straightforward simplicity of a woman who wants something and sees no reason to be indirect about wanting it. Dr. Fenwick, for his part, seemed to understand this perfectly and to find it refreshing. He settled into the armchair opposite with the ease of a man who has spent 70 years arriving at honesty, and now finds it the most comfortable position available. "You want to know about Edward Hartwell," he said. I want to know whatever you think is relevant," Miss Marple replied. "You've been in this village a long time. 43 years. I delivered Oliver Hartwell, as it happens." He accepted his coffee and looked at it thoughtfully. Edward died 11 years ago. Heart failure, which was genuine. I want to be clear about that. He'd had a condition since his 50s. It was not unexpected. A pause, though the timing was not ideal. In what sense? He and Violet had been having considerable difficulties. Financial, marital, the two are often the same difficulty wearing different clothes. Edward had made some poor investments in the late 90s, and the recovery was slow and not complete. There was talk at one point of selling Hartwell House. Fenwick turned his coffee cup in his hands. And then Edward died, and it emerged that he had taken out a rather substantial life insurance policy some 18 months before his death. Violet was comfortable. The house was safe. "I see," said Miss Marple. "There was talk," Fenwick said carefully. "There is always talk. It amounted to nothing officially. I had no hesitation in signing the death certificate. I had none then, and I have none now." He looked at her directly. "But I am 71, and I have seen a great many things, and I will tell you that Violet Hartwell has always had the quality that certain people have, of arranging circumstances to suit herself, in ways that are never quite visible until some time has passed." "And Claire Drummond?" Fenwick was quiet for a moment. "Claire was engaged to Edward, you know, before Violet. Long before. They were young. It ended when Edward met Violet at some house party in Hampshire, quite abruptly by all accounts." He set his cup down. Claire never married. She and her sister moved to Lesser Dunning 8 years ago, which was 3 years after Edward died. She said it was for the countryside. And you don't think it was for the countryside. "I think," Fenwick said, "that there are people who are drawn to unfinished things, who cannot leave a question alone until they have an answer." He paused. "Whether that is admirable or dangerous rather depends on the question." Miss Marple knitted for a moment in silence. Then she said, "Did you know Geoffrey Parish before he came here?" "I did not, though I gather others did." He said it carefully, with the precision of a man offering a fact and not an interpretation. "Others?" Miss Marple repeated. "As there were rumours, nothing more, that Parish had some prior connection to Violet. Before Lesser Dunning, before Edward died even, I couldn't verify it, and I didn't try, but Mrs. Pooley, whom I imagine you've already visited, the honey was very good," Miss Marple said. "Mrs. Pooley's sister lives in Cheltenham, where Parish came from. And the sister mentioned, at some point, that Parish had known a woman called Violet there, years ago." He spread his hands. "Cheltenham is not a small place. There are many Violets, but, Miss Marple agreed." She walked to the library after Fenwick left. Lesser Dunning had a small one, housed in a converted cottage near the church, staffed on Tuesday afternoons by a retired schoolteacher named Mr. a Carey who had the librarian's gift of knowing where everything was, and the scholar's gift of knowing why it mattered. She asked him about the local newspaper archives, and he produced them with quiet efficiency, bound volumes going back 30 years, and a newer microfiche system that he operated with the pride of someone who has mastered a technology not designed for their generation. She was looking for Geoffrey Parish, but she did not find him. She found instead, in a copy of the Lesser Dunning Gazette from 9 years ago, a small notice regarding the Marchmont land. It had changed hands, the notice said, from the Marchmont estate to a property development company. The company was named. Miss Marple read the name twice. It was not a name she recognized. But the address registered for the company was in Cheltenham, and one of the two listed directors shared a surname with no one in Lesser Dunning, and with one person, as far as Miss Marple could determine, in the whole of the surrounding county. The surname was Drummond. She sat with this for a while in the quiet library, rain making its patient commentary on the windows, Mr. Carey reshelving things at the far end of the room with the soft industry of a man at peace with his purpose. Claire Drummond had not come to Lesser Dunning for the countryside. Claire Drummond had come because the Marchmont land was here, and the Marchmont land had, for reasons not yet entirely clear, some connection to a past that Claire had been constructing a very patient and very private response to for a very long time. The question that remained was whether Geoffrey Parish had known this, and the question beneath that question, which Miss Marple was not yet ready to ask aloud, was whether Violet Hartwell had known it too. Wednesday morning arrived with the news that someone had broken into Hartwell House. Nothing had been taken, or rather nothing that Violet Hartwell could immediately identify as missing, but the study on the ground floor had been comprehensively searched. Drawers opened, papers disturbed, the small bureau beside the window forced with something that had left a clean, bright scratch. On the old wood. Violet had discovered it at 7 in the morning and telephoned the police before she had telephoned anyone else, which Inspector Groves noted and found interesting. Oliver had been in the house. He had heard nothing. This last detail moved through the village by 9 o'clock, and acquired by 10, and a significance it may or may not have deserved. Miss Marple heard it from Mrs. Wetherall, who appeared at the Dunning Arms at 9:30, with the slightly breathless quality of someone who has walked faster than usual in the service of information. "A break-in," Mrs. Wetherall said, settling into the resident's lounge with the permanence of someone who has not come to leave quickly. "The study, specifically." And Oliver heard nothing, which either means he sleeps like the dead, she paused apparently aware of the phrase, or means he wasn't there at all, or means he was there and heard something and is saying he didn't. Or means, Miss Marple said, that whoever broke in knew what they were doing and was very quiet about it. Mrs. Wetherall considered this with the mild disappointment of someone who preferred the more dramatic options. "I suppose. But what would anyone want from Violet's study?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is precisely the right question." She visited Hartwell House at 11, not by invitation, but with the confidence of a woman who has established, over several days, the kind of quiet presence that people forget to refuse. Violet was in the hall with Inspector Groves when she arrived, and Groves, to his credit, simply incorporated her into the conversation without making it an issue. The bureau contained personal correspondence, Violet was saying. She had the contained look of someone managing something large in a small space. Financial papers, though nothing sensitive. Old household accounts. There's some letters. What kind of letters? Groves asked. A brief hesitation. Personal ones, from Geoffrey. We'll need to see whatever remains. Of course, she paused. Some of them are gone. I can't tell you which ones precisely, not without going through everything. But there was a bundle, tied with string, and the string is there but the letters are not. Groves wrote in his notebook. Miss Marple looked at the scratch on the bureau from a respectful distance, and thought about the particular quality of that hesitation. Not the hesitation of someone surprised, but of someone arriving at a decision they had already rehearsed. She found Oliver in the garden, despite the earlier rain, standing at the edge of the kitchen garden with a cup of coffee, and the expression of a man who has come outside because inside has become untenable. "Mr. I Hartwell," she said pleasantly. "Do you mind if I join you for a moment?" He looked at her with the slightly wary recognition of someone who has not yet decided whether she is safe. "If you like." They stood together looking at the kitchen garden, which was productive and slightly overgrown in the way of gardens that are tended by someone with more enthusiasm than time. "The break-in," Miss Marple said, in a tone that made it a neutral subject rather than an accusation. "You heard nothing at all? Nothing. I take a sleeping tablet occasionally. My doctor in London prescribed them. I took one Monday night." He said it flatly, as a person states a fact they know will be doubted. "I realize how that sounds." "It sounds like someone who has difficulty sleeping," Miss Marple said, "which is entirely understandable under the circumstances." He glanced at her. "The inspector thinks I'm lying." "The inspector is doing his job, which requires him to consider all possibilities." She paused. "Mr. Hartwell, the letters your mother mentioned, the ones from Mr. Parrish that were taken, do you know what was in them?" A long silence. A wood pigeon made its repetitive complaint from somewhere in the copper beech. "Some of them," Oliver said at last. "Not all. Mother didn't show them to me. I found one. Last month, by accident in the bureau. I wasn't looking for anything." He stopped. It made certain things clear. About how long Parrish and my mother had known each other. About what their arrangement had been before he came here. His jaw was set in the way Miss Marple had noticed at the fete. He'd been blackmailing her. For years, my father's death, there were apparently questions, things that Parrish knew about, or claimed to know about. I don't know if any of it was true, but my mother had been paying him, and then at some point the payments became something else. The relationship became something else. And you confronted Mr. Parrish. At the White Hart, yes. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I told him I knew. He called me a thief because I'd found the letter. He said I'd stolen it from my mother's private correspondence, which was rather rich, considering. A short, humourless sound. He wasn't frightened. That was the thing. He laughed. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. And your mother? Did you confront her? I tried. She denied it, all of it. He looked at the kitchen garden. She's very good at denial. She has always been very good at it. Miss Marple thought about this carefully. About blackmail, and its particular corrosive patience. About a man who laughed when confronted. About letters removed from a bureau. Removed by someone who knew they were there, and knew, very specifically, which ones could not be allowed to remain. One more question, she said. The sleeping tablet you took Monday night. Where do you keep them? Oliver frowned. In my room. In my jacket pocket, usually. Why? Just an old woman being thorough. Miss Marple said comfortably. She walked back toward the house. Behind her, Oliver Hartwell stayed at the edge of the kitchen garden with his cooling coffee, and the slow expression of someone beginning to understand that the questions being asked of him are not quite the questions they appear to be. Inside the house, in the hall, Violet Hartwell was watching from the window. She had been watching for some time. Thursday was dry and still, and Miss Marple spent the morning writing letters. This was not unusual. She wrote letters with regularity to her nephew Raymond, to various friends distributed across the English countryside, to her doctor in St. Mary Mead, who had strong views about her walking too much in damp weather. But the letter she wrote first, before the others, was not to anyone in her established correspondence. It was to Claire Drummond, and it was an invitation to tea. The letter was brief, but pleasant, and entirely without apparent agenda. It expressed admiration for a remark Claire had made at the fete about the Hartwell roses, a remark Miss Marple had not actually heard but felt confident enough to attribute, and suggested that two people with a shared interest in gardens and village life might find a quiet hour's conversation agreeable. She sent it with the hotel's morning post, and then settled in to wait with the patience of someone who has set a very gentle trap and has all the time in the world. Claire Drummond arrived at 3 o'clock precisely. She was punctual in the manner of people for whom punctuality is not courtesy, but control, a way of arriving on one's own terms before one can be caught arriving. She wore grey today, a soft wool that suited her considerably better than it would have suited most women, and she carried herself with the characteristic straightness that Miss Marple had been thinking about since Saturday. They settled in the residence lounge with tea and the biscuits Miss Marple had bought from Mrs. Pooley and not otherwise needed, and they talked about gardens for 10 minutes with the pleasant thoroughness of two women who genuinely know about gardens and are also both doing something else entirely. "You've lived in Lesser Dunning 8 years," Miss Marple said, in the tone of someone making agreeable conversation. "You must feel quite settled by now." "Quite," Claire said. "I always think it takes at least 5 years to truly understand a village. The surface is visible from the start, of course, but the texture of a place takes time." A pause. "I've been in St. Mary Mead for most of my life. I sometimes think I know it too well. One loses the capacity for surprise." "Is surprise desirable?" Claire asked. "I think it depends enormously on the nature of the surprise." Miss Marple looked at her pleasantly. "You knew Geoffrey Parish before he came to Lesser Dunning." The quality of Claire's stillness changed, very slightly, the way a room changes when someone in it stops breathing for a moment and then begins again. "What makes you say that?" "The Marchmont Land Company," Miss Marple said, comfortably, as though discussing something of mild interest. "I'm afraid I have a terrible weakness for local archives. Mr. Carey at the library is wonderfully helpful. And then there was the way you reacted when you saw him in Mrs. Pooley's shop. Mrs. Pooley has a very accurate memory." A silence. Outside, the car moved slowly along the wet street. "It wasn't a secret I was concealing from the police," Claire said, with the precision of someone who has thought carefully about the distinction. "I simply hadn't volunteered it." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "There is a difference, legally speaking, though perhaps a smaller one than we sometimes hope." Claire set her teacup down. For the first time since she had arrived, she looked not controlled but tired, the particular tiredness that comes from maintaining something for too long. "Geoffrey Parish ruined my brother," she said, "not recently, 22 years ago. My brother Robert was in property development. Nothing grand, a small regional firm. Parrish was a partner. He manipulated the company accounts. He moved money into subsidiary arrangements that Robert knew nothing about and could not explain to the relevant authorities when questions were asked. Robert was prosecuted. He was not convicted, but the firm was destroyed and his reputation with it. He died 4 years later. The official cause was a stroke. She looked at her hands. He was 51. Miss Marple said nothing, but her expression held the specific quality of attention that is indistinguishable from sympathy and is not entirely separate from it. "I found Parrish," Claire continued. "It took me a long time, but I found him. And I found that he had done similar things before Robert and was doing them again. The Marchmont development, the arrangement with Oliver Hartwell, the money he was extracting from Violet." A pause. "I came here to document it, to build a case that could be brought to the authorities properly, with evidence that couldn't be disputed." "And instead," Miss Marple said gently, "he ended up dead at a garden party." "Yes, which rather complicates your position. Considerably." Claire looked at her directly. "Miss Marple, I did not kill Geoffrey Parrish. I wanted him prosecuted. I wanted him publicly and legally destroyed. Death is," she paused, with the expression of someone finding the precise word, "insufficient. It resolves nothing. It answers nothing. It simply stops things. I needed things to continue, in a courtroom, on record." Miss Marple regarded her for a long moment. She thought about the night of the fete, about Claire holding Violet's hand, about one thing at a time said in the voice of someone managing a sequence, as she thought about the break-in and the missing letters, and the particular kind of evidence that becomes dangerous when it exists and more dangerous still when it disappears. "The letters that were taken from Violet's study," Miss Marple said. "You took them." Not a question. Claire's chin lifted slightly. "They contained material that implicated several people, including my own connection to the Marchmont Company. I needed time to determine which of them could be used constructively and which would only muddy the water, and which would protect Violet." A long pause. "Yes." Miss Marple poured more tea for them both, with the unhurried domesticity of a woman settling in for a comfortable afternoon. "Miss Drummond," she said, "I should like you to tell me everything you know about Geoffrey Parrish's activities in Cheltenham. Everything, including the parts you have decided are better left quiet." She looked up. "I'm not the police, but I have found over the years that things left quiet have a very unfortunate tendency to make noise at precisely the wrong moment." Claire looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite trust, and not quite its absence, but something that occupied the interesting territory between them. Then she began to talk. And Miss Marple listened, as she always did, with the whole of her considerable attention, and began at last to see the complete shape of the thing. Friday morning, and Miss Marple did not go out, as she sat in her room at the Dunning Arms with her knitting in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and worked through what she knew with the methodical care of someone arranging furniture in a room where the dimensions are finally clear. She knew this. Geoffrey Parrish had been a man who collected vulnerabilities the way other men collect stamps, with patience, with system, with a quiet pleasure in the accumulation. He had ruined Claire's brother through financial manipulation. He had extracted money from Violet Hartwell through knowledge, real or manufactured, of the circumstances surrounding Edward Hartwell's death. He had taken Oliver's architectural work and his money and laughed when confronted about it. He had involved himself with the Marchmont land in ways that had damaged multiple people simultaneously. Oh, with the elegant efficiency of a man who understood that the most durable form of power is the kind its victims are too ashamed to report. He had been, in the precise sense of the word, a parasite. And parasites, Miss Marple reflected, accumulate enemies with the same systematic thoroughness with which they accumulate advantage. The question was never whether someone had wanted Geoffrey Parrish dead. The question was which particular someone had moved from wanting to doing, and when, and how. She set down her knitting and picked up the small notebook she carried in her cardigan pocket, a habit of 50 years, a notebook that had witnessed the private architecture of more solved puzzles than she could readily count. She wrote 3 names in her small, precise hand. Beneath Oliver's name, she wrote, rage, debt, a public confrontation, visible, volatile, insufficient patience for digoxin. Beneath Violet's name, she wrote, fear, long practice of management, prior knowledge of poison, possible, but the letters complicate. Why remove them if innocent? Why keep them if guilty? Beneath Claire's name, she wrote, motive abundant, patience extraordinary, access to information, broke into the study, but wanted prosecution, not death. Believes death is insufficient. She looked at the 3 names for a while. Then she wrote a 4th name, and stared at it, and thought about a thing she had been carefully not thinking about since Monday. The small detail she had noticed in the hall at Hartwell House, the one she had decided to sit with quietly. What she had seen was this: a coat on the hall stand, a woman's coat, light in colour, summer weight, and the kind of coat that would read from a distance as pale clothing on someone moving quickly toward a side door. The coat belonged to neither Violet Hartwell nor Claire Drummond. She had established this through the simple method of noticing, on subsequent visits, that Violet wore navy and Claire wore grey, and that neither of them owned a coat of that particular shade, a warm cream, faintly institutional, the sort worn by women who spend time in professional environments where appearance is managed but not indulged. She had been waiting to identify the coat's owner. On Friday afternoon, she identified her. It was Constable Peake who provided the identification, entirely without knowing she had done so, and she came to the Dunning Arms at 2 o'clock with a follow-up question from Inspector Groves about the timing of certain observations at the fete. And she wore, over her uniform, against the mild chill of the afternoon, a cream-coloured jacket that she removed in the warmth of the residence lounge, and hung over the back of her chair. Miss Marple looked at the jacket. She looked at Constable Peake, young, quiet, alert, with the composed efficiency of someone who performs their role with thorough invisibility. She thought about several things simultaneously. About digoxin, which is a drug of precise medical application, and requires specific knowledge to dose with lethal accuracy. About the preliminary post-mortem results, which Groves had shared with her, he noting that the quantity administered suggested familiarity with the pharmacology, not a layperson's guess. About Constable Peake, who had been first on the scene and had moved through the conservatory with the systematic attention of someone who knows what they are looking for and whether they have found it. She thought about the rooting hormone bottle and the inside-out glove. She thought about the missing glass, Parrish's Pym's glass, which had not been located. She thought about the fact that Constable Peake had been assigned to the Fates police liaison before the murder, a routine precaution for large village events, and had therefore been present and moving freely through Hartwell House from the beginning of the afternoon. She thought about a conversation she had overheard on Saturday, in the general confusion after the body was discovered, between Peake and the constable with the oversized helmet. A fragment only, but distinct. Peake saying quietly, "It'll be the sun you'll see," not as speculation, but as certainty. Not as a theory, but as a destination. And she thought most carefully of all about something Claire Drummond had told her on Thursday, in the long, careful unfolding of 22 years of history. Claire had said, "I was not the only person looking for Parrish. There was someone else, someone who contacted Robert's former colleagues 2 years ago, asking questions about the Cheltenham fraud. A woman." She gave a false name, but one of Robert's colleagues remembered her description. Miss Marple had asked for the description. It had been precise, and it had been familiar, and she had sat with it through Thursday evening and all of Friday morning, turning it in her mind with the care of someone handling something fragile and consequential. Now she watched Constable Peake answer Groves's questions with the composed efficiency that she had initially read as professional virtue, and she understood that she had been looking all week at a performance so consistent and so quiet that it had functioned as perfect camouflage. The most dangerous disguise, she had always found, was simple competence. She answered Groves's questions pleasantly, and saw Peake out and closed the door of the residence lounge, and stood for a moment in the quiet room. She knew who had killed Geoffrey Parrish. The question that remained, the question that had given this particular case its peculiar weight from the beginning, was what, oh precisely, she intended to do about it. Saturday morning came clear and bright, with the particular innocence of weather that has no memory of what preceded it. Miss Marple packed her bag with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman who has always found packing clarifying, the physical act of closing things away, lending a certain order to the mind as well as the luggage. She was precise about it. The grey cardigan, the notebook, the biscuits Mrs. Pooley had wrapped for the journey, though Miss Marple suspected she would give them to Mrs. Wetherall, who would eat them with the unself-conscious pleasure of someone who has never once considered whether she deserved a biscuit. She had telephoned Inspector Groves at 8 o'clock. She had asked him one question. He had answered it, as with the slight pause of a man realizing the question is more significant than it appears. And the answer had confirmed the last thing she needed confirmed. Constable Peake had, 18 months ago, transferred to Lesser Dunning from a previous posting in Gloucestershire. Before her police career, she had trained for 2 years as a pharmacology technician. She had left the training before qualification, for reasons her file described simply as personal. Gloucestershire bordered Cheltenham. Miss Marple sat on the edge of the hotel bed with her packed bag beside her and her hands folded in her lap. And she thought about Robert Drummond, who had died at 51 of a stroke, brought on by the wreckage of everything he had built. She thought about Claire, who had spent 22 years constructing a careful legal case against the man who had destroyed her brother and had been robbed, at the last moment, of the prosecution she had waited for so long. She thought about Oliver Hartwell, who would carry for the rest of his life the particular damage of learning that his father's death was attended by questions that would now never be answered. She thought about Violet, who had lived inside a blackmailer's grip for years and had survived it through the same quality of managed composure that Miss Marple had, from the beginning, found both admirable and faintly terrible. And she thought about a young woman who had lost someone, A father, she believed, though she could not be certain. The connection was inferential, not confirmed, to the same man by the same mechanism, and who had trained in pharmacology and then abandoned it, and who had eventually found her way into a police uniform in a small village where a particular piece of Marchmont land had once changed hands through a company that bore a connection to Geoffrey Parrish's long history of patient destruction. Not Claire's company, Parrish's, a subsidiary buried carefully that Claire had uncovered in her research and had mentioned on Thursday with the neutrality of someone reciting a fact they have examined many times. The subsidiary had a second director. The name was not Drummond. Miss Marple had looked at the name and had thought about a pharmacology student who had left her training for personal reasons and had subsequently, after some years, entered the police force, and she had thought about the coat on the hall stand, and the inside-out glove, and the missing glass, and the precise lethal dose of a drug that requires specific knowledge to administer with confidence. She had thought about a woman who had watched, from inside the official investigation, while the obvious suspicion settled onto Oliver Hartwell, and who had done nothing to redirect it and several small things to confirm it. And she had thought about Geoffrey Parrish, who had laughed. She went to see Constable Peake at 9:30. Peake was at the village police office, a small practical room on the ground floor of the municipal building that smelled of printer ink and institutional carpet. She looked up when Miss Marple came in with the alert composure that had not, in any of their meetings, shown the slightest crack. "Miss Marple, are you leaving today?" "I am," Miss Marple said. "I wanted to say goodbye and to return something." She set a small object on the desk between them. It was a button, small, cream-coloured, with a particular weave pattern on its face. Peake looked at it. Her expression did not change, but her hands resting on the desk became very still. "It was caught on the latch of the side door," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "The door to the kitchen garden. I noticed it on Monday and picked it up. A habit of long standing, I'm afraid. One pockets small things without thinking." A pause. "It matches the second buttonhole on your jacket, which has, I see, been resewn." A silence of considerable weight settled between them. "I imagine," Miss Marple continued, in the same gentle and conversational tone, that Inspector Groves will reach his own conclusions in due course. He is a more thorough man than he initially appears." She paused again. "I also imagine that when he does, he will find Claire Drummond's research rather useful. She has been very thorough." Peake said very quietly, "He destroyed my father." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I thought it might be something like that." "He was laughing. At the fete. When I saw him with his Pims, talking to Violet Hartwell, and laughing, he had ruined 3 families that I know of, and he was standing in a garden laughing." Something moved in Peake's composed face, briefly, and was controlled. "I had the solution in my pocket. I had been carrying it for 6 months." "I know," Miss Marple said. She picked up the button and placed it in her cardigan pocket. "I will not tell you," she said, "all what I know, or what I think, or what I believe you did. That is not something I am going to do today." She looked at Peake steadily. "But I will tell you that justice is a very large word, and that people who take it entirely into their own hands generally find that it fits less comfortably than they imagined." She picked up her bag. "Goodbye, Constable Peake." She walked out into the bright Saturday morning and along the high street to where Mrs. Wetherell's car was waiting. And she gave Mrs. Wetherell the biscuits. And she answered several questions about her stay with pleasant vagueness, and she looked out at the lesser Dunning houses as they drove through the village, at the post office, the butcher's, the White Hart, or the lane that led to Hartwell House, with the expression of someone completing a private reckoning that they will carry quietly and alone. She had solved the case. She had solved it completely in every particular, with the thoroughness she brought to all things. She had simply decided, for the first and only time in a long life of solving, not to say so. In her cardigan pocket, the small cream button sat against her hand. She left it there,